Welcome back to Bible Study That Matters. We are now in week 2, module 2, and we're going to take on an entirely new topic as we get into this next section. In fact, the next 3 weeks. We just dealt with module 1, and as we studied module 1, we talked about interpretation. Not only what we interpret, but how we interpret. And if you recall, we talked about interpretation basically breaking down into exegesis and application. And so we want a reading that is not only reliable, but now we're saying that we also want a reading that is relevant, that actually speaks to our lives. In the first place, though, as we learned, we need to be objective, rational, reasoned. And so we encourage you to come to the text with a good methodology in a way that will keep us from reading our bias and our prejudice into the text, so that when we read the Christian scriptures, we don't read our own story into the Christian scriptures in such a way that doesn't allow the text to speak. But we also now want to turn to the idea that the scriptures mean something to us. And so if you will, you can put it into these two categories. What we talked about last week in the module was essentially what did the text mean back then, therefore the context of the text. And now what do the scriptures mean today? So what it meant and what it means. Now as we move into this next section of the course, we're actually going to take on 3 weeks of studying what we call genre. So week 2, week 3, and week 4 will be analyzing the different genres of the scriptures. This is important because, and to go back to what we talked about last week, and what I mentioned today, is this whole idea of methodology. If methodology helps us read in very positive ways, and then methodology helps us read in a way that restrains us from making things happen in the text that don't actually happen, then let us have a good methodology. And so we're teaching essentially that you should know how to read genres. So what is genre? Well, genre is a type of literature. And now as we move into 2014, we basically would include not only a type of literature, but any type of artifact that a human constructs. And so I'm expanding the idea of genre from literary to music, to film, to poetry, of course, and anything that a human being constructs that we can study. And it essentially has 2 elements to it. All right? So genre is a type of literature or a type of artifact that human beings construct in a way that gives them meaning. Each genre has 2 elements to it, and it's very important to know those elements. Number 1, every genre has conventions. Every genre has conventions. These conventions are essentially those things or those elements of the genre that make it a particular genre. So for instance, narrative, which we'll talk about in just a minute, narrative has certain conventions to it. Poetry has certain conventions to it. For instance, like rhyme or like meter or heightened language. And so a genre, each genre has its own conventions, and if we don't study those conventions, then we won't know how to read effectively. The second element, very important to genre, is expectations. Every genre gives the reader or the observer an expectation. And so there are certain conventions, for instance, in narrative that sets us up to expect certain things. So for instance, when I read a story, I want that story to grab me and take me in, and then eventually I want the conflict in that story to be resolved. If that conflict is not resolved, then in some ways I have to rethink what that story is, whether or not that's a good story. It begins to, if you will, mess with my worldview. And so conventions will have expectations, and when we read, we want to see those expectations fulfilled. So the expectations in a genre set us up, if you will. And let me talk about that just a little bit, because this is very important for our reading. As we move into Module 2, and as you begin to reflect on what we're going to do in Module 2, I want you to know that we're going to study narrative primarily in the Old Testament, and then we're also going to study poetry primarily in the Old Testament. And so it will be very important not only to know those conventions, and we will talk about that in the next week, but also what are the expectations from that genre. Now, I think it's very important for this module, in this introduction, I want to talk about narrative. So I'm going to choose narrative, but take heart, we'll talk about biblical poetry as we get into this next week. Narrative, it's very interesting to think about narrative, or if you will, a very simple word for narrative is story. Story is central to Christianity, and it's central to Judaism. And story is central to Christianity. And in fact, if you look at the entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, we have a complete story. It goes from creation all the way until we reach heaven, and there is redemption, there is restoration. Not only is story, narrative, central to Christianity, it is also central to the Christian scriptures. It's very intriguing to note that 50% of the Christian scriptures is narrative or story. About 40% in the Old Testament and about 60% in the New Testament. So right here in the very beginning, we can say that to learn narrative and to learn the basic conventions of narrative is to learn how to read almost half of the Bible. And what I want you to think about, again, as we talk about narrative, is what does narrative set us up to expect or to happen? And essentially, I'm going to use an example of romance films or a romantic film. I can mention a number of films here, but essentially you are probably very familiar with a romantic film. Now think with me on this. What do you expect when, or even if and when you go to the theater and you want to see a film that is in the romance genre? Well, essentially, you expect, even though you actually don't know how the story is going to go, you still have certain expectations. There are certain, now listen to my word, conventions that must happen. So in a romance film, very simple, boy meets girl, and they fall in love, and then of course, and this is very important in narrative, there's a conflict in that narrative, something goes wrong, they break up, and then eventually they go through all of these different elements of trying to get the relationship back. The relationship, though, is over, but not really, because then they get back together, and then you know how it ends. They live happily ever after. All right? Now, that's a very cursory example of a genre, but I want you to see that if you went to a movie and paid good money to watch a romance film, and the woman dies at the end and they don't get together, or the man has something really tragic happen to him so that they don't get together, your expectations have been disrupted. Essentially, you paid good money to have the right conventions, and then you had certain expectations as you went into that movie. All we're saying at this point is genre has certain expectations that occur, And we actually know those. Whether we know them or not, we actually know those conventions. And then those conventions give us expectations as we move on with the story. That's very important as we look at genre here in Module 2. So, genre has certain conventions that set us up for certain expectations. Now, there's much more that we will study this week, so put on your seat belts. It's going to be kind of a wild ride as we turn to the scriptures and we look at some stories in scripture, and we also look at poetry. When you're done with Module 2, I think you will come out knowing how to read a good portion of the Bible in a much better way. But let me end with one example. In Genesis chapter 38, we have the story of Judah. Now, Judah was the son of Jacob. Remember, Jacob had 12 sons. And it's really interesting in the book of Genesis where this occurs, because from Genesis 37 to 50, basically we have the story of Joseph. You've probably heard of Joseph. Maybe you know Joseph very well. But it's interesting that we start with Joseph in chapter 37 in Genesis. And then in chapter 38, it switches. If you will, the convention kind of changes and shifts into the story of Judah. And so chapter 38 in Genesis is an entire story on Judah, and it looks like it doesn't have anything to do with the story of Joseph from 37 to 50. So if you want to look at it this way, Genesis 37, we start with the story of Joseph and eventually going down to Egypt. Then in 39, we pick up with the story of Joseph, but right in the middle is this strange story about Judah. All right. What is that story doing? And why is chapter 38 there? All right. There are some people who will say, well, this is put together by different authors and editors, which is fine, but you need to understand that essentially this is just not a good editing job. There are others who will say, yes, this should be in there, and then they go through all kinds of gymnastics to try to reconcile it, if you will. One of the things that we're going to learn is that story is there for a reason. We may not know the reason, but when we read the text carefully, when we understand sometimes how narratives work, then let us go in and let's take Genesis chapter 37 very seriously, and let's take Genesis chapter 38 seriously. The term I'm going to use here is there is a gap in the story. What does it mean to step into that gap and understand what Genesis is telling us?